They said the rain had begun 7 days before the ceremony, but no one in Hallowick Cross remembered exactly when it started. It had simply crept into the sky like a rumor no one wanted to believe. And by the time the first drops tapped against the mossy windows of St. Elitha's parish, it was already too late to say where the storm had come from. Each morning, the fog thickened, drawing down from the marshes like smoke from a damp pyre, and the villagers, mostly farmers and poor tradesmen, began to whisper to one another that the bell in the chapel tower no longer rang true. Instead of chiming clearly at matins, it groaned like a thing buried too deep and dragged too far. Still, the preparations for the wedding continued, for Isaac Bellamy, the youngest deacon ever ordained in southern Maryland, had insisted that nothing, no weather, no omen, no superstition passed down from old women with shaky teeth, could stop the day he would wed Mercy Aldridge, the woman who had, according to him, appeared in a dream before she ever arrived by boat. And when she did arrive, if one could call it that, she did not step off a dock or cross by road, but instead simply walked out of the cypress woods one morning wearing a white dress, her hem soaked with dew and ash, her hair already braided like a bride, and her voice soft as if practiced in prayer. She claimed no family, save for a dead British merchant who'd once traded rum and iron in the Carolinas, and a Creole mother known in whispers as the Swamp Doctor, who disappeared before Mercy turned 10. No one saw her arrive, but everyone knew when she had. Every dog in the parish howled, the hens laid blood-specked eggs, and Father Thorne, an aging priest known for surviving a bout of fever dreams during the Maryland pestilence of 1696, stumbled out of the rectory muttering a psalm that no one recognized. From the start, Mercy was both ADM, I read and feared. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was not warm. It had a stillness, a hush, like the inside of a sealed tomb. Her skin held no blemish, her eyes were too dark to read, and when she smiled, even children grew quiet, as if they were being listened to instead of entertained. Isaac, entranced, told anyone who would listen that he had never known joy until he touched her hand. "She is divinely sent," he said once, too loudly at the local tavern, clutching a Bible as if to justify it. "A balm to my soul, a vision clothed in flesh." But others were not so convinced. Ruth Garrett, the apothecary's wife, claimed that she saw Mercy standing barefoot in the graveyard one night, hands outstretched, not in prayer, but in stillness, palms open, as if feeling for something rising beneath the soil. On the 6th day of rain, a young altar boy named Elias fell from the bell tower, trying to cover the leak in the steeple roof, and broke his leg in 2 places. He later said he had seen a woman in white standing inside the font, though no one had entered the church that morning. The font itself, carved from dark limestone and placed near the altar in 1609, was said to be a relic brought over from a Flemish monastery long ago destroyed in a fire. Its water never needed refilling, nor did it ever dry up. On the morning of the wedding, the clouds parted for the first time in a week, revealing a pale, bruised sun that did not warm the air. The townspeople gathered in tight clusters, some holding candles, others clutching rosaries, and watched in uneasy silence as Isaac Bellamy stood at the altar in full vestments, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly beneath his white gloves. There was no music, only the groan of wet wood and the sharp creak of the chapel doors as Mercy entered, unaccompanied. Her dress, bone white and trailing behind her like a fog. She made no eye contact. Her veil, opaque and laced with symbols none could recognize, covered her face completely, yet her feet made no sound on the stone floor. Father Thorn, who had not slept in 3 nights, stepped forward to begin the ceremony, but stopped when Mercy passed the font and gently placed her fingers in the water. The moment her skin touched it, the chapel shifted, ever so slightly, as if the air had tightened, and the candles flickered inward, not out. Mercy whispered something in Latin, not the Latin taught in Rome, but something older, rounder, full of soft consonants and slithering vowels, and Father Thorn's mouth went dry. Still, fearing shame or scandal, the priest proceeded. Vows were spoken. Isaac, trembling, spoke his love aloud, though no one could recall the exact words afterward. Mercy said little, but when she nodded, her head bowed not to Isaac, but to the crucifix behind him. At last, the final rite came. The blessing. The congregation, some now fidgeting, others quietly weeping without knowing why, watched as Father Thorn dipped his fingers into the font and reached for Mercy's brow. The moment the water touched her skin, her body jolted, violently, unnaturally, like a fish pulled too hard from a net. Her mouth opened, and what came out was not a scream but a layered sound, like many voices speaking at once from a pit. The water in the font began to boil, hissing like oil poured onto fire, and Mercy's eyes rolled upward until only white remained. Her arms flailed, but not at random. They formed sigils in the air, patterns no one recognized but everyone instinctively feared. Her body lifted for a moment, a foot above the floor, before slamming backward onto the stone with a crack that echoed like a shot through the chapel. When Father Thorn knelt to assist her, he found her mouth full of foam, her neck twisted unnaturally, and her face, though pale, still wearing a faint, peaceful smile. But the most inexplicable thing was that she had drowned. There was no water anywhere near her, save for the font, which held barely enough to baptize a child. Yet her lungs, when hecked later by the village surgeon, were flooded as though she had been held under water for hours. Father Thorn, weeping, attempted to pray over her body, but his voice failed him. "She must not be buried within the chapel grounds," he said hoarsely. "Something follows her." That night, in silence and shame, Mercy Alderidge was buried in the unblessed woods behind the church. No cross was placed. No hymn was sung. Isaac disappeared for 3 days afterward, and when he returned, he was gaunt, his eyes sunken, claiming he had spoken to her in dreams. The earth where she was buried steamed for 3 days after, even though the rain had returned and the ground was cool. Birds would not land on her grave. Dogs would not sniff near it. On the 3rd night after her burial, at exactly midnight, the bell of St. Elitha's rang 13 times, though no rope had been pulled, and the tower was empty. Elias, the altar boy, ran to the priest's quarters and said he had seen a white veil floating through the pews, gliding as though seeking a groom who had fled. Ruth Garrett claimed she heard someone humming a wedding tune from inside the sealed chapel. The next morning, Father Thorn found the font full again, but this time the water was warm, tinged with a pink hue that had not been there before. And in the center of the font lay a single strand of dark hair, too long to belong to any living woman in town, too dry to have floated naturally. Mercy was dead. Everyone had seen it. But deep in the air of Hallowick Cross, something had shifted. The holy water had boiled. The font had become a grave. And the bride, who had drowned once already, was not finished with her vows. 3 months had passed since the storm-choked wedding of Mercy Alderridge, since the holy water turned against her, and the bride drowned in a font that had never held more than a child's blessing, and though time in Hallowick Cross moved forward by candle and harvest, something in the soil, in the breath of the air, in the ticking of the wooden church clock had paused, like a note held too long in a hymn that no one could finish. The rain had stopped the day after her burial, but the ground never dried, and the grass that grew around St. Elitha's parish turned a shade too dark, more blue than green, more bruised than blooming. And those who tended the graves spoke little now, keeping their prayers clipped, their feet swift, for ever since the bell rang 13 times unbidden, even the oldest among them remembered the old laws. The ones whispered before papal Latin ever touched the land. The ones that warned if the dead do not close their mouths, the living must not answer their names. Father Thorn, once proud and full-chested in his recitations, was now a thin reed of a man, his robes hanging off him like wrinkled parchment, his lips cracked from muttered prayers he could no longer sleep without, and more often than not, he was found staring into the font that had boiled beneath Mercy's skin, his eyes wide, his pupils shrunk to pinheads as though he expected it to speak again. Though what frightened him most was not that it might, but that it already had in dreams, in echoes, in the laughter of children repeating rhymes they never learned. And then, one cold morning at the edge of winter, when the frost had crept across the chapel glass and the fog from the marsh swallowed all sound, Isaac Bellamy returned, not on foot or wagon, but crawling up the chapel steps on his hands and knees, soaked through, clutching a burlap sack that dragged behind him like a shroud-soaken, in rot, his face sunken, the skin beneath his eyes the color of old wine. And when Father Thorn opened the doors to the sanctuary and saw the young deacon collapsed on the stone, he did not greet him, only whispered, "The river gave you back." And Isaac, with cracked lips and fingernails torn down to flesh, nodded and whispered, "She calls me from the water. She never finished the vow." They took him in, because they could not turn away the living, even those touched by the dead. And as the villagers peered from behind lace curtains and shuttered glass, the rumors grew like mold. That Isaac had been living by the old well where Mercy's veil had last been seen, that he was seen at night whispering to reflections, that the white flowers left at her grave never wilted, but bled from the stems, and some claimed that if you said her name 3 times facing the font, your breath would fog from the inside and you'd smell sea salt on the air. Though the coast lay 2 days' ride east, still, none of that prepared the town for what came next, when Isaac, now clad in borrowed black, burst into the rectory one dusk, dragging the sack with him, and spilled its contents before Father Thorn. Damp, heavy linens stitched with lace, yellowed lilies bound with hair, and at the center a white silk dress, not aged, not rotted, but pristine, save for a dampness that could not be dried by any fire. And with trembling hands Isaac laid it upon the altar and whispered, "I must wed her again. She asked me. She never finished her vow, and neither did I. I must bless her name with new water." Father Thorn recoiled, shaking his head, clutching the crucifix around his neck until his fingers turned white, and shouted, "There will be no such blasphemy. Your grief has unmoored your reason." But Isaac, now rising to his full height, a pistol rusted with blood in his hand, pressed its barrel to his oed and chin, and said, "Then I will marry her in hell, and you will damn me by doing nothing." And the old priest, trembling, agreed, not out of cowardice, but out of something older, some quiet understanding that some pacts are older than the church and once made cannot be unmade without blood or blessing. So, under a night as windless as a crypt, with the moon drowned in clouds, Father Thorn unlocked the chapel, lit the candles himself, and watched as Isaac laid the silk dress beside the altar, speaking to it softly as if coaxing a child to wake. And from behind the sealed doors of the sacristy, they brought her body. Yes, her body. For Isaac had returned to the woods with shovel and madness and bullion till his fingers bled, and by some profane miracle she had not rotted, not spoiled, not sagged or blackened, but remained whole, her cheeks pale and lips bruised violet, as though merely asleep beneath thin layers of earth, her hair still pinned, her veil still folded across her chest, and though Father Thorn knew every scripture, every sermon, every rule ever written for how to rebuke the devil, he could not deny what his eyes beheld, that this was Mercy Alderidge, untouched by time, and something deep in his bones told him that she was not resting, but waiting. They laid her on the stone floor before the font, dressed her in silk, combed her hair with fingers shaking like dying branches, and Isaac, no longer trembling, recited his vows again, not in English, not in Latin, but in a tongue that echoed from the stone, repeating words not meant for human ears, and when he reached the part of the rite where the blessing must be given, he stepped forward, dipped his own hand into the font, though the water now ran darker, thicker, almost oily, and with all the reverence of a priest, pressed it to Mercy's cold brow, and what followed was not a resurrection, not a miracle, but a rejection. The very walls of St. Elitha's screamed, not in echo, but in anguish, as if the stone itself wept, and black liquid bled from the seams between every block, dripping like tears into the pews, while the candles flared backwards, their flames stretching toward the font as if drawn by breath. And then the font cracked, splitting with a thunderclap, and the water inside bubbled as if boiling from the depths of the earth, and Mercy's corpse, pale and still moments before, sat bolt upright, gasping like a babe slapped into life, her eyes open, her mouth wet with blood or ink, and she turned her head, not to Isaac, not to Thorn, but to the crucifix above the altar, and said, in a voice layered with centuries, "You made me die thirsty." Isaac fell to his knees, weeping, kissing her hand, swearing love and devotion, promising no more silence, no more delay. But before Father Thorn could intervene, before a single word of command or exorcism could pass his lips, Mercy rose, not like a woman walking, but like a weightless thing, her feet hovering a hair above the stone, her veil billowing though no wind moved, and she turned to the font, now full to the brim with dark, swirling water, and without hesitation stepped into it. And the impossible happened again. She sank, not knee-deep, not waist-deep, but entirely, her form disappearing as though the font led to some deep ocean no map had ever charted, and within seconds she was gone. Not floating, not bleeding, but vanished beneath the surface, and the water stilled, black as pitch and just as cold. Isaac screamed, reaching in, trying to pull her back, but the water repelled his hand, turning his palm blue and blistered, and Thorn, white-haired and wide-eyed, knew then what he had allowed. Not a resurrection, but a tethering, a second drowning, this time chosen, this time not resisted, and so he ordered the church sealed, the font boarded, the doors barred with iron, blessed by 3 bishops, and declared the chapel forbidden, desecrated, lost to any blessing the church might offer. But the villagers knew better. The key. I said that every night since, at the stroke of midnight, wet footsteps echoed across the altar, not in haste, not in panic, but in slow, deliberate pacing, always stopping at the edge of the font, always waiting to rise again. And though no one dared enter the chapel again, the well behind it began to hum at dusk. The ground never froze even in deepest winter, and in the weeks that followed, 3 children were born still, each one with their mouths sealed shut, as if nature feared what they might say. Isaac Bellamy was never seen again, but the sack he carried was found years later behind the altar, empty except for a single braid of hair and a ring of lilies that had not wilted, only darkened, petals curling inward like tongues afraid to speak. And as for the font, it never emptied again. No matter how many boards were nailed, how many stones placed over its mouth, water dripped from it always, thick, red-veined water that smelled of salt and thyme and things forgotten. And some had claimed that if you knelt beside it long enough, you would hear her voice rising like steam, whispering vows to no one, asking only one thing, to be wed again, a third time, and for the font to be filled, not with water, but with blood. They say time ends differently where the chapel stands, that the dirt forgets how to decay, that the wind won't blow unless it is told to, and that the trees along the outer edge of Hallowick Cross bow inward, not toward the sun, but toward the blackened chapel stones of St. Elitha's, which has not rung a holy bell in over 200 years, but still manages, somehow, to echo each midnight with 13 cold tolls, long and hollow as breath, exhaled from beneath water, and it is here, where the rain never dries, where the ivy won't grow, and where the birds fly around but never across, that the third wedding begins, not with invitation nor gathering, but with a shift in the ground's temperature, a pressure behind the eyes of every man and woman born within walking distance of the church, a low groan that hums in the molars like a coming sickness. The villagers of present-day Hallowick Cross no longer keep parish records, no longer christen children, and no longer name the dates of their dead, for every household has a story, whether whispered at bedside or carved into a butter churn, of what happened on October 31st, 1704, and again on that same date in 1705, and again in 1804, and now once more, on the threshold of a new midnight, beneath the bulging eye of a swollen blood moon, the veil has returned. Not drifting through fog or found folded beneath a pew, but already placed with impossible intent atop the edge of the cracked and swollen font, still damp, still smelling faintly of salt and lilies and old wine, as if it has never been folded at all, only passed between the hands of time and desire. and though the people of Hallowig Cross claim no allegiance to the old rites, still they close their windows, still they smear lamb's blood on the hinges, and still they light candles facing the direction of the forgotten chapel bell tower. Not to worship, but to keep it away, her away, though even they no longer say her name aloud, not after what happened to the boy in 1804 who dared to touch the veil, who vanished before his voice could deepen, who was seen once more 5 years later, kneeling at the foot of the font with his eyes scooped hollow, and something ancient singing through the gap where his teeth once were. And now, as the moon reaches its highest breath, a rusted gate creaks open without hands. A door swings wide, though no living feet have climbed its steps, and deep within the chapel, the candles, long since melted to waxy dust, are alight once more. Lit not by flame, but by memory, as if the stones themselves remember what it meant to bear witness. The air inside no longer tastes of mildew, but of something older, metallic, damp, gravid with expectation, and across the altar, the crucifix has turned upside down of its own. 1. Wait, not violently, but as though persuaded by a force that does not shout, but whispers its dominion. And there, rising from the floorboards like mist through a broken seal, is the figure of Isaac Bellamy, unaged, unbowed, clad still in the black of his borrowed vestments, his mouth muttering phrases that never had vowels, his eyes seeing only what the living dare not name, for Isaac has not slept in centuries. He has wandered fields, haunted woods, stood knee-deep in marshes speaking to reflections that do not mirror, and all for one singular purpose. She is not finished, he whispers. Her vow was never sealed, and now, as he steps toward the font for the third and final time, the chapel itself groans beneath him. Not in rot, but in readiness, in hunger, in sacred collapse. And behind him, unseen but undeniable, the air shimmers, and mercy arrives, not walking, not floating, but unfolding, her form unspooling like smoke rising from blessed oil, her veil trailing behind her, unblemished, as though time has never dared touch her. Her fingers long, her feet unshod, her eyes twin black mirrors with the memory of drowning tucked behind their gleam. She does not blink, she does not weep, she only watches. And when Isaac reaches the font, now full to its rim with thick crimson liquid that bubbles without heat, he turns to her and does not smile, for joy has no place here, only bows his head and says, "This time you wed the world." And the font answers with a sound like wet laughter swallowed by stone, and Mercy steps forward. Not toward him, but toward the veil, which she lifts and places over her head herself, and for the first time in all recorded memory, she speaks aloud, not in tongues or layered chants, but in English, in the voice of a woman who has buried every last version of herself. "I do," she says, and the font explodes upward, not in chaos, but in surrender, as a jet of red arcs across the altar, splashing the crucifix which melts like wax into the stone, and the walls of St. Elitha's shudder, not collapsing, but expanding, as if the chapel were growing low. Alongs, breathing her in, accepting her not as guest, but as bride and bridegroom both. There is no priest now, no witness needed, no groom of flesh required. for mercy no longer answers to the rights of men or the God they claimed. She has found a deeper order, written in thirst, in silence, in blood, remembered by water, and as she steps into the font a third time, it does not consume her. It receives her, slowly, lovingly, inch by inch, until the last thing to sink beneath the surface is the curve of her veil, which does not ripple, does not float, but folds inward as if pulled into the mouth of something endless. And outside, all at once, the fields of Hallowik Cross split in long symmetrical lines, not as if torn by quake, but drawn with intent, and from each wound seeps water, red, holy, humming, and the wells boil with the sound of bells, and the children born that night come without tongues but with voices still, speaking only in dreams, and their dreams speak only of her. And in the morning, when the chapel doors swing open and the first fool dares enter, they will find the altar gone, the walls clean, the crucifix vanished, and the font now dry, its stone cracked and empty save for a ring of lilies untouched by decay, a single braid of hair, and the veil folded, not where they left it, but now atop the pulpit, waiting not to be worn, but to be chosen again. For the wedding was not a conclusion, but a beginning, and what drowned 3 times does not stay dead, does not need resurrection, does not need witnesses. For the third wedding was not between horn and woman, but between the unholy thirst of time and the sacred silence of stone. And so the people of Hallowik Cross no longer speak of mercy, not even in warning, for they have learned that her name is not a curse, but a mirror, and that to call her is not to summon her, but to remind her you're still here. And now, when the moon is full, and the chapel bell tolls its 13 thuds, no one counts aloud. No one dares look to the font, for they know that mercy is not waiting in the water any more. She has walked out,